Welcome and good afternoon and good evening to episode 8 of our Seeds of Justice, where we are now looking at climate justice as part of our November Climate Month. So the last 2 weeks we have looked at stories from the COP, and we've received some really great interviews and comments and observations during the COP. And for that, we want to thank our supporters and sponsors, Heinrich Stiftung of the Southeast Asia Office, for supporting us, and of course the Asian Development Bank Environmental Law Champions Program. My name is Matthew Baird. I'm the director of the Asian Research Institute for Environmental Law. And so here we are at the end of COP26, billed as one of the most significant COPs since the Paris COP 5 years ago. And the question really is, has the COP advanced climate justice? Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, in releasing a report called Making Peace with Nature earlier this year, said that humanity is waging war on nature. This is senseless and suicidal. Making peace with nature, securing its health, and building on the critical and underlying benefits that it provides are key to a prosperous and sustainable future for all. In the same report, Inga Anderson, the Executive Director of the United Nations Environment Programme, wrote, "Loss of biodiversity and ecosystem integrity, together with climate change and pollution, will undermine our efforts on 80% of the assessed Sustainable Development Goal targets, making it even more difficult to report progress on poverty reduction, hunger, health, water, cities, and climate." Indeed, in July this year, The Economist, in responding to the IPCC's 6th report on the physical science basis of climate change, said that there was no safe place, the 3 degrees C. I should also point out The Economist 20 years ago pointed out that coal was public enemy #1 due to not only the climate change implications and the greenhouse gas emissions, but because of the deaths caused by mining, the pollution caused by burning, and the pollution and water pollution and air pollution caused by the slag heaps following the burning of coal and the production of energy. The enormous environmental, social, and now climate change implications of coal have been known for over 30 years. And yet this time in COP26, people celebrate that for the first time, coal was actually mentioned, but we weren't going to phase it out. We're only going to look at potentially phasing it out. So today we're joined by 2 exceptional speakers. We're joined by Leo Goelnitz from Heinrich Böll Stiftung, the Executive Director in Southeast Asia Office, and Saño, the Executive Director of Greenpeace Southeast Asia. Welcome both of you to our Seeds of Justice podcast today. So Leo, I was going to ask you first, if you'd like to just introduce yourself and tell us sort of what you've been working on with respect to climate justice.
Yes, hello everyone. Thank you for the invitation to be in this talk. My name is Lea Goelnitz, and I'm the director of the Southeast Asia office of Heinrich Böll Stiftung. And Heinrich Böll Stiftung is a German organization, which is a think tank and a network that stands for green ideas and projects. And we work together with more than 100 partner projects in 60 countries, and we have offices in more than 30 countries. The Southeast Asia office is working, among other things, on ecology and social justice issues across the region, and of course also including energy and climate issues. And here we also focus on community solutions and like transboundary discussions, and to see how we're in Southeast Asia, a region which is hit very hard by climate change, and a lot still needs to be done, how there can be good advocacy work and policy recommendation to achieve this. Yeah, I'm looking forward to the talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leah. And yeah, welcome. And if you could just give you a short introduction and about some of the work that Greenpeace Southeast Asia does on climate justice, and I know the great work you're doing on air pollution as well.
Thank you very much, Matthew, and happy to be on this panel, Seeds of Justice. I'm Saño. I'm the current Executive Director of Greenpeace Southeast Asia, and I'm also in that capacity leading the work on climate justice and liability for Greenpeace, and also anchored on the legal petition we had initiated with a Commission on Human Rights in the Philippines, aiming to hold what we call the carbon majors, the top corporate polluters of the world, accountable for the climate crisis, for the harms to human rights that it causes. I also think it's worth mentioning that I'm a former climate negotiator, the former lead negotiator of the Philippines in the UN climate negotiations. I also like to call myself a recovering climate negotiator. So yeah, I'm having spent a great deal of my life working on climate, and now a good deal of that involving the work of Greenpeace, both from the point of view of climate and energy, where we work a lot on ensuring that the energy transition is happening fast enough, not just in Southeast Asia but in many parts of the world, and also working strongly on the issue of deforestation in Indonesia. And as I mentioned, the climate justice and liability work anchored on creative pieces of legal action initiated and co-powered with communities that are adversely affected by climate change.
Thanks, Jeb. And we might come back to the forest pledge, the pledge that seemed to hold so much promise, but seemed by the end of COP26 to even unravel. So I guess you can probably tell what my feelings are in terms of the outcome of COP26. We did go into the COP with very, very high expectation. And I was just wondering, Aliyah, if I can ask you first. Well, we finished the COP26. It went into overtime. We've had the declaration. Lots of promises, some commitments, and certainly lots of air miles again. What for you were some of the key messages or takeaway messages from COP26 in Glasgow?
First, I would say I agree. The expectations were really, really high. Like a failure, was basically not possible. So in a way, there were now mixed messages. We see that COP is called a fragile win, and there's no leading to a phase out of coal, but a phase down. And also states were asked to remove inefficient subsidies for oil, gas, and coal. And of course, that is seen as very controversial. And I think Amnesty International put it in very drastic words when they described the outcome as catastrophic failure and betrayal to humanity. I think to a certain extent, a few things can be highlighted as some progress, that there was a lot of attention on human rights language. It did not find its way in the end to the document, but there was this discourse. It also helped that human rights was also framed as environmental issues were framed as a human rights issue just weeks before. And then what was also new and of course good was that there was a focus on the core drivers like fossil fuel, which was formally never discussed before. And there were many new alliances or statements and treaties like the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative, and a few networks, and also many indigenous people were quite vocal. Then there were the governments of Costa Rica and Denmark who had their newly launched Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, which I think was a positive highlight. And of course, many things were watered down, but maybe shedding light on also, for example, mentioning how many fossil fuel industry representatives were there. I mean, there was a push for at least demanding accountability and transparency in a new light. And of course, more countries joined the Alliance to End Coal. It's important to say US, China, India, and Australia did not join.
Australia, that's correct.
But a few things also in regard to ending fossil fuel finance. There was, to a certain degree, a breakthrough, but it remains to be seen how much pressure can be put on governments and other financial institutions as well to join and to see if there are loopholes. I guess this is more legal questions for later. And also, as you mentioned before, the declaration on forest and land use can be important, and 5 countries from Southeast Asia are part of it. So taken together, they are small, but some important steps I think we can see, especially towards accountability and transparency. And there was some courage to name a few points, but not to really confront the elephant in the room. So this is something to discuss further, but this would be my main takeaway. So disappointment, but also small lights, maybe.
So, and some might say that although there was no naming of the elephant, at least there was the recognition that there is a large elephant in the room. So yeah, from your perspective, in terms of key takeaway messages from COP26, what would
Thanks again, Matthew. Like many people who have observed the COP in Glasgow, I'd like to be a bit more realistic about my takeaway messages, because what I've seen was an outpouring of disappointment in the aftermath, immediate aftermath of the COP. And the dominant theme we were hearing, both inside the COP and from outside, is this is better than nothing. And for me, that's sad, because if this is what we have become, that we are happy with a better than nothing outcome, and that is our bold response to the climate crisis, then it speaks a lot about the sincerity of world leaders in addressing the issue. And we've seen the power dynamics within the COP, where vulnerable countries, poorer countries, have to settle for the crumbs, and their main theme is they live to fight another day, and that's see you in Egypt, and we continue this conversation. But I agree with Leia. There are a few groundbreaking things we've seen, like the mention of fossil fuels. In my experience following the COP since 1997, there this is the first time that the term fossil fuels have been mentioned in any COP decision in a substantive way. And while the reference is rather weak, it is a reference that's never been done before. Ultimately, it was called the phase down of fossil fuels, and also subsidies on fossil fuels. It was also it was also qualified, and therefore that would have a limited effect. Only unabated coal is going to be phased down, as well as inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, just to make that clear. Those are diplomatic compromise so that they are qualified. There was also some grounds gained in terms of transparency. Now, when I'm a firm believer that carbon offsets have no place in solving the climate crisis right now, and the transparency discussions in Glasgow has led to at least a bit of comfort, that carbon cowboys or rich countries cannot game the system so easily. They will still do that. They have done that in the past, in the Kyoto Protocol. But yeah, at least we can say that those are among the positives that have come out of the COP, including some of the bilateral commitments, or at least some pronouncements from countries, including the UK, on providing support for loss and damage. And for those who are listening to us right now, loss and damage is the consequence of countries not able to adapt to the ravages of climate change. And therefore, in the Glasgow COP, developing countries have been asking for a financial facility for loss and damage. And rich countries refuse to do that, to concede that, in particular the US and the EU. So at least now there is some clarity on how the Santiago Network on Loss and Damage could move forward with those commitments. And again, developing countries live to fight another day.
So, and I think that chorus of disappointment, certainly afterwards, that the small island states and developing countries, sorry, my office manager is very keen on climate justice, was very, very vocal. I mean, I think focusing also on some of the wins, some of these issues is also very important. One of the things that we often find with our younger, our students and young environmental lawyers is that feeling that, it's not, people are not addressing these challenges. So Leah, can I sort of ask you first about this loss and damage? This was the first time that it did raise itself. It's now in a sort of official pronouncement, so at least that's the beginning. It's clearly a key issue for developing countries, and this discussion about historical polluters and current polluters. It still exacerbates the climate injustice when historical polluters can get away from their polluter pays obligations. How important do you think it is that loss and damage has now been sort of recognised and mentioned, and is there now, on the table, I guess, for further discussion?
Yeah, I think it's very important that this got a lot more attention, and civil society and climate activists really mobilized a lot around this. And I think it became more was part of the news, and maybe more people learned about that. This is financing all of this is a major issue. But of course, it is disappointing that there was no delivery on this demand, and especially also the urgency was not really recognized by the big countries, the main polluters, and the rich countries. And I think it's a small win to say, okay, we keep discussing the issue. I mean, even next year in Egypt, it's a bit, what Jeb is also saying. It's okay, we keep talking about it. It's a bit intangible at the moment, and clearly the support of the US, the EU, and the UK would have been needed to support a funding facility and give a major push. And I think it was also quite interesting that in lots of the media, mainly India was blamed as well for not being too supportive. And I think it's quite urgent and important to address this, because the failure of this climate finance solution disadvantages many countries, also here in Southeast Asia, where there are a few countries, they are actually quite ambitious. And they really emphasize the need for international assistance for the NDCs. And for example, Indonesia, Philippines, Cambodia, and some others, they are committed to go further, but they condition it to receiving international assistance. And as long as this is not given and there's no support for more vulnerable countries, I think that's a kind of a deadlock or turning point, which still needs to be found.
Yeah, so just on those two, I mean, in terms of the finance, I mean, there was a great deal made that, in terms of the financial institutions, $45 trillion that were signed up to the sort of the carbon pledges, of which only, a fraction was actually going to go to anything that was going to be related to finance. But there was still this finance gap. In other words, the US, the UK, Australia did not, Canada, no one came up with the money that's needed to do this transition. So that's one issue, and then the loss and damage. And I wanted to ask you, in terms of now that loss and damage is there, will this perhaps mean some more litigation? Thinking of the carbon majors reference of the Philippine Human Rights Commission, but does this give us an opportunity for public interest activists to say, well, loss and damage there, the polluters are responsible. If the states aren't going to do it, we're just going to have to litigate and sue and really make sure that the polluter pays. Is this a likelihood in 2022 leading up to what might happen in Egypt?
I think that is a possibility, although I think it's more a question for Jeb to answer. He's more into litigation.
Yeah. What do you think about that opportunity?
Yeah, it opens up. Remember, I just recall when we were negotiating the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage in the wake of Super Typhoon Haiyan in 2013, and that's the COP19, where it was loss and damage was basically firmly established into the UNFCCC system. We were not calling for compensation yet that time. We were hoping that compensation could become part of the conversation. And now that it has progressed up to this point, and now there are countries that are willing to put money into the loss and damage work. I do feel and I do hope that it could inspire a groundswell of creative legal action, because this is an acknowledgement of accountability. And that's why we have been fighting hard for loss and damage to be paid attention to as an issue in the climate negotiations. That is one of the motivations for vulnerable countries to bring forward the loss and damage issue. And this was largely marginalized for many, many years before 2013. And so now that we have it, now that there is room um, for 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 or space for loss and damage to be seen more seriously. That is my hope. I don't think I have a crystal ball on how that plays out in courts of law. It's still an uphill climb in terms of how uh, cases could prosper in the context of litigation. But I think it could really, Matthew. That's a really good question, and with that question, I think you're starting to help people imagine that that is possible.
And just in terms of the issues about access, I mean, initially at the COP, there was a lot of discussion about problems of access. I wonder, how was the representation of women and Indigenous people? It still seemed that this was a COP that was, and partly because of COVID, still seemed to exclude those voices. And
I think COVID was a complicating factor for ensuring inclusivity in the COP. But even prior to COVID, all of these conferences, all of these meetings have never been a level playing field for the marginalized sectors. And so it's not a surprise that at COP26, indigenous communities representation and women's representation, and not just sort of this binary gender issue, but a lot of diversity issues are at play in any UN conference. After all, those who represent governments there are privileged. They have, university degrees. They speak English. They have comfortable lives. As most of them are diplomats. So it is a privileged venue, and therefore it's always a challenge for the marginalized communities, the inarticulate, to assert their voices in the COP. And COVID has made that a bit more pronounced, and in particular the difficulty of being able to travel to the COP. That's partly to blame. COVID is partly to blame, but how the UK government as a host plays a big, difference in enabling or discouraging participation, as they vacillated up to the last minute whether they would cover quarantine costs or even vaccination costs. So a lot of us, including myself, had decided a while ago that no, I'm not going to travel to the COP, and many of us have even been contracted COVID because we were not vaccinated.
Yes. So that seemed to be a sort of a new challenge. And in terms of what happens next in terms of now that there's an agreement to go to Egypt sort of in a year, or to make that Egypt conference look a lot at some of the issues that weren't addressed. I mean, what does that mean for us in terms of activists or people who are want to work to see a better outcome from the COP? Leah, what's
Okay.
that sort of thought? Is it likely to be something that we can use? I mean, the same thing happened, I guess, in Kunming, that the first part of the biodiversity COP occurred, and now we've got a sort of a part two in April. Will that give us an opportunity to raise these issues, to put them forward, to back to the representatives next year?
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, adding also to what Yab said about these talks being particularly exclusive, which was surprising in the second year of the pandemic to act if there was no vaccine inequality and with all the issues for travel and quarantine. Yeah, the hope is, of course, that there are some lessons learned, that in the next year the discussions that were started can be picked up. And for climate activists and civil society, it means to look very closely and follow up and advocate for, like, the points that were made, and of course to make sure to keep the discussions alive so they are not starting back to square one in Egypt. And also, of course, to advocate that there is a better exchange and more participation. Who knows what the next year will bring. And the pandemic and climate crisis really have in common that they both amplify inequality and injustice. And one would assume we would learn from these two crisis responses. And yeah, also the criticism around the COP and how it was organized. Maybe there's some lessons learned for the next meeting. And I think, yeah, many of these commitments need, close follow-up and advocacy work with those responsible, and to make sure more voices can be heard, and that maybe more people can actually travel and be there in Egypt, or that there's a hybrid online version organized in a better way. It remains to be seen.
And yeah, what do you think? Do you think it's going to be this opportunity to revisit some of the decisions from Glasgow?
And before I go to the decisions from Glasgow, I want to build on what Leah had just emphasized. And this is in particular, and you also referred to Kunming, another treaty conference. Now, it should be remembered that in 2019, before the pandemic happened, the UNGA itself, the General Assembly itself, just on the eve of the pandemic, 2019, agreed, all countries committing to the global development goal of universal health coverage, meaning all people across the world should receive health services according to their needs. Now, in the case of vaccines, it was also agreed in that particular General Assembly meeting that the most vulnerable, those most at risk for suffering serious health impacts, would receive vaccines first. Did we see that? Absolutely not. Those who needed the vaccines most in this pandemic received it last. And if this is the way that the climate crisis is going to be dealt with by governments, then we will see the climate crisis escalate in a worse way than we will ever imagine. And so I think the way forward here is truly to hold to account those who continue to cause this crisis, and following through those things that have been decided out of Glasgow. I mean, there are very definitive decisions made in Glasgow that closes some chapters, including the Paris Agreement rulebook had been completed. So that's a big milestone. Then we go into implementation. The Egypt COP will be a process COP, not necessarily an outcome COP like Glasgow. So a lot of follow through needs to happen. A lot of new working groups or work programs have been created. So let's not leave it to those who decided that to keep those decisions alive, because we would need to exert a lot of pressure from outside, and ever more than ever we should clamor for urgency because they keep kicking the can down the road. This is basically what we've seen in every COP. And they did the same in Glasgow. They kicked the can down the road. They're basically saying, all right, there's no more time to come up with a more ambitious outcome here. Let's call it a day and see everyone next year. And so, yeah, we will be watching every move for each country, but this also highlights the need for national action now. Every country like what Leah had said, has been given one year, and we come back next year, so that those pledges are ratcheted up genuinely, both in terms of mitigation actions, climate finance, and all crucial actions that need to be taken, so that the credibility of this process could be revived.
So, and Leah, I mean, bringing those two catastrophic crises together. I mean, COVID-19, which hasn't yet finished, and climate change, which is occurring and will get worse. I mean, it was interesting. I mean, Deb's point about how even after a declaration of that those in need should receive vaccines first in the event of a hypothetical pandemic, we have seen massive wealth inequality as a consequence of COVID. We've seen rich nations essentially work towards vaccines, and whatever they've distributed have been marginal and minor. I mean, there are people getting third and fourth doses of vaccines when vast numbers of people across continents of Africa and Asia are not even have received their first vaccines. So I'm wondering, as Zeb says, is this an indicative future for what might happen when some of these climate issues become even more extreme than they are now, and we're actually feeling on a even more regular basis some of these extreme challenges with climate change?
Yeah, I know what you mean. It seems a bit dark and easy to think that there will be more inward looking by countries, because you're right, in the pandemic, first many countries acted individually, and we see also big difference in the climate crisis. But of course, health and climate are international, very, very transboundary issues. So it can only be solved together and with mutual agreements, stepping forward. And maybe my hope is that everyone just still needed some time to figure it out and to learn, and the instinct to lock up and look inwards and put ourselves first was there, but maybe we will learn from this in the future. And a glimpse of why I think it's possible that we still see, I mean, also in the COP, we see like different alliances. So it might not be like all the states together, but there's like smaller groups of like progressive states who come up with an idea, like Denmark and Costa Rica, and then they seek others to join them. So it's of course slower and more incremental, but there's also like different groups or variations of alliances and groups, and maybe we see this in both the health and the climate crisis, that there's smaller steps.
And I mean, I just sort of a question, because I know you work on freedom of expression and the role of journalists as well. I sort of observed in many countries that there have been erosions of rights in respect of vaccines, or in terms of curtailment of freedom of movement, arguably justifiable in times of pandemic. But there still seems to be governments that are quite happy to keep exercising those powers to control the media, to jail journalists, to control people's movements and behaviour. Do we have to also perhaps work on removing those COVID restrictions, and perhaps, because I'm a great believer with Yeb, that transparency is possibly one of our greatest weapons that we can use against all injustice, whether it's climate or health. But do you see that within this region there have been plans to release some of those restrictions on freedoms and freedom of expression, for example, and freedom of movement? Or do you think we're going to keep seeing governments resort to this as crises further emerge?
Of course, I don't have a definite answer, but yes, the pandemic was, of course, used as a pretext to restrict certain freedoms. And the hope is that, of course, that it will be lifted. but it might be too early to say, because we also see the other way around, that people form like mutual funds and communities. Everything shifted online, so literally everything shifted online. Also, the organizing and supporting and helping people across boundaries or expressing solidarity in different ways. So I think it might be too early to say how it plays out. I don't think anything is decided yet.
And yeah, I mean, Leah's point about how new coalitions are forming, people are really working, using technology, using innovation. I mean, there can be some exciting opportunities there. Is there this potential? Can we work? Can countries come together with activist groups such as Greenpeace, working on strategies and strategic options to really move beyond coal and beyond fossil fuels?
Yeah, the short answer is indeed yes, and it should happen. However, when we talk about alliances within the UN climate negotiations, it's more complicated than we think. And often these alliances lead to the collapse of the conversation. And the reason why is because the framework itself, the framework of the entire climate regime rests on the tension that has always been there between those who have caused this problem and those who suffer from it, who in fact have not contributed much to the global emissions that's causing the climate crisis. So that tension remains, and no amount of diplomatic, sleight of hand could could fix that so easily. But I do agree that because this is the 26th COP, and a lot of young people who are below 26 years old who are out in the streets and clamoring for justice, clamoring for change. Their entire life, we have been trying to negotiate ourselves out of this crisis. And I don't think we can negotiate ourselves out of this crisis so easily and fast enough. So the COP is there, and it's important. The sovereign nations that are trying to come to a lasting solution for the climate crisis, is truly crucial that they do that. But we've proven as well that they cannot do it fast enough. So what do we do with that? You're right. We go to cities, towns, churches, schools. The investment should happen in many places, and provincial, subnational government levels. It should happen. The transition should start to happen at a smaller level, and not wait until the COP has given us those signals. Business, for example, progressive business should take this opportunity to help the world transition fast enough, instead of waiting for those signals from the international community.
So it's been an amazing conversation. We're sort of running out of time, and I'll just before we close, I'd like to sort of ask you about what next for the future of climate justice. But before I do that, I just wanted to get back to one point, which was the discussion about the deforestation pledge. Initially, I thought this was a very exciting thing. Deforestation obviously contributes not only significantly to carbon emissions, but also to biodiversity collapse, which is another crisis that we're facing. So, Yeb, can I ask you about your reaction or your observations about the forest pledge and what it might really mean?
Well, for those who are not familiar with the role of forests in terms of combating climate change, it can be simply put. Even if we transition the whole energy system, even all of us drive electric cars today, and we lose all of the remaining forests in Indonesia, in the Congo Basin, and in the Amazon, we are nowhere near averting the climate crisis. So that's how important forests are, and that's why it was really promising to see countries do the pledge to stop deforestation. And the sensitive thing about that is, when do they want that to happen? And 2030 was supposed to be the target year, and then some countries vacillated and change that. And then some critical countries, crucial countries, started to walk away from that pledge in a way. So, and forgive me, I cannot mention those countries right now because there's some legal implications. But that's the situation. And our misgiving about that is many of these countries have actually promised to stop deforestation as early as 2020. So they keep moving the goalposts, and the forests just don't have the. We cannot for the forest. We just cannot afford to keep moving those goalposts. Forests play that's such a very crucial climate regulation role. So it's quite tragic that forest countries, governments are not taking this issue seriously. And as we speak, there's no clarity with which how forests are going to be protected, even after COP26.
So, Leah, did you want to? I mean, it seems that the forests are still going to be something that we're going to have to keep fighting for over the years to come. So in terms of concluding, sort of final words on this sort of climate justice, seeds of justice, Leah, how do you, what next? What do you think 2022 leading to 2030 will bring? What are the key things that we could really do to promote more climate justice?
I think it's important to narrow down what is really doable and be ambitious and support other ambitious actors to form like stronger alliances and to make sure that civil society keep working on this. And I think legal way to pressure is also something that will become more important. And like, for example, in Germany currently, there is no new government yet. It's still the coalition. But there are some very specific things that are quite obvious, which can be done. Like, for example, now Germany was standing on the sideline and phasing out the internal combustion.
Sorry, Leah, I think we've just had a bit of technical issue. Sorry, Leah, you were talking about Germany phasing out.
Germany to phase out the internal combustion engine. Yes, so there's still, like, I think there is no one size fits all approach. Every country has different like industries and interests, but to really find everyone's turning point that would make a difference and to really focus on that and not to keep pushing the deadlines further. I think that's important.
And yeah, Benny, sort of final words on these issues for at least today.
Yes, thanks again, Matthew. Indeed, the great measure of a climate summit is whether it has passed the climate justice test. And plainly, I don't think it has for COP26, like many other COPs. So what do we do now? I think we need to stand firm on the work to hold both fossil fuel companies and governments abetting that. We need to hold them accountable through creative legal action, and in many jurisdictions, we must continue pursuing these pieces of litigation, especially pieces of litigation that are put forward by the most vulnerable. Because when the most vulnerable carry forward those voices and claim that power, it becomes really meaningful, and ensure rapid transition to clean energy, to clean development in the most ambitious way at the subnational level in the private sector, and help build the movement become stronger. I believe that the climate movement and the climate justice movement has become stronger than ever, and we should continue helping each other build that and use our connectedness as we have been gifted with such connectedness. It's a miracle that we have this webcast happening, which would not have been possible in COP5 or COP10. So it's a good time to be alive. It's a good time to be part of the movement.
And Yeb Saño, Executive Director for Greenpeace Southeast Asia, thank you very much. And more importantly, thank you for all the work that you have done and are continuing to do it, and doing it in a positive way to provide hope. And I think that's very important for people who may be disappointed by the COP to realize, yes, this is COP26. There will be more to come and more action is needed, but that's something that we can do. Leah Goelnitz, from Director of Heinrich Böll Stiftung Southeast Asia Office, thank you again also for the amazing work that Heinrich Böll Stiftung does on justice issues broadly and climate justice issues in particular. It's been a great pleasure, and we certainly thank you for supporting the opportunity for us to engage with activists at the COP, and also looking at climate justice issues tonight. I think it is very important that while it is possible to feel disappointed, depressed, or distressed by what can be perceived as a failure of COP26, we have to remember that this is an ongoing struggle. The struggle for justice is always ongoing. The struggle for climate justice continues. And the important thing, as Yeb and Leah has shown, is that the coalitions, the alliances, and the strength of the movement is as strong, if not stronger, than it's ever been in the 30 years since, in the Rio conference in 1992, the Framework Convention on Climate Change was signed. And I think that's important for us all to remember, that this is 30 years since it was signed, since people came together in the Rio Declaration. The Framework Convention on Climate Change, Agenda 21, and the Biodiversity Convention, all in 1992, which was a great year, obviously, for the environment. Since then, we've had to deal and respond to the practical measures, and obviously the practice takes time and is more difficult. So thank you very much again for your participation tonight. And I would like to invite everyone to come back next week when we have two great speakers looking at climate litigation, which I think is going to be a really interesting and growing area, certainly over the next number of years. Bryony Eels and Cecile Sekango from the Asian Development Bank will be talking about climate litigation with particular reference to the Asia-Pacific region and some of the ideas that may be carrying on. And it's been an extraordinary time. Again, thank you very much. And from myself, Matthew Baird, the Asian Research Institute for Environmental Law, and backstage people, Pum and Paolo, thank you for listening to the Seeds of Justice, and look forward to seeing you next week. Good night. Thanks, Leah. Thanks, Yeb.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.